Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's Catheta webinar, live on August 31st. For those who don't already know, Catheta means learning and Creek. In that respect, today we'll be learning about title grants management with Vince Franco. My name is Brooke Warrington. I'm the Training and Development Specialist here at the Native Learning Center, and we're so thrilled that you could join us today. Please follow along as I read the disclaimer aloud. This webinar provides a summary of fundamental concepts, requirements, and/or procedures within the allotted 90 minutes. The material discussed does not illustrate all possible scenarios that could be applicable. Before we get started, I want to familiarize you with some of the features available and how the environment works. If you look at the top of your screen, you'll see an icon of either a person with their hand raised or just a hand. With that icon, you can either raise your hand, agree, disagree, or even step away. Now your screen should look similar to this graphic here. To the bottom left, you'll see a box that says Files. Here you'll find today's presentation. Please feel free to download a copy for yourself. Simply click the item you would like to download and then click the arrow pointing downwards to download and save onto your device. Once the item is downloaded, it should appear in your device's download section. The second box labeled Web Links is where you'll find our survey about today's webinar, along with any other links that will be seen throughout today's presentation. Finally, to the right of the screen, we have a chat box available. This is how you're going to communicate with the instructor and the NLC staff. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to interact by using the chat box. Simply type your message and hit enter, or click the up arrow icon button to submit. We do encourage class participation, so please feel free to write in those questions or comments. Any tech support issues you have should also be submitted here. Know that most of your tech issues could be solved by exiting and re-entering the meeting room. Let's all try out the chat box together now by typing in your name, where you're joining us from, and your tribal affiliation. All right, guys, with that, it is with great pleasure that I introduce today's webinar instructor, Vince Franco. And Vince, I'll hand it off to you now.
All right. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. Hello, everybody. I see some folks are close to my home in Southeast Florida, down around Fort Lauderdale, and others of you from all over the country. Welcome this afternoon. Something a little different as I'm glancing at this, you'll notice that the presentation is blue, light blue, which is actually my presentation. It's not the Native Learning Center branding for the first time. So this is very, very kind of a new venture, very excited about this. I'm glad you're with me. There are 36 plus or minus people with us today. They're still putting in, got folks from California, Connecticut, all over the place, Arkansas. Wonderful, wonderful. At the moment, I'm in beautiful Atlanta, Georgia, a day after the big storm came up through the Gulf Coast and hit the northwestern part of Florida up by Tallahassee and into Georgia. And us folks finally down in the southeast coast of Florida, which usually gets hammered by those tropical storms, missed this one completely, knocking on wood. Anyway, what we're going to be doing today and for the next 3 sessions after today is taking kind of a deep dive into grants management under the realm of NAHASDA, because obviously this program is being sponsored by the Native Learning Center, who also falls under the auspices of NAHASDA and the Indian Housing Block Grant. So you're going to hear and see a lot of references to NAHASDA, also to the Indian Housing Block Grant, to HUD, and to the Office of Native American Programs, EWONAP, etc., as we go through. And I'll go through the agenda in just a few minutes. But again, I just want to welcome everyone and let you know that I'm not only going to be doing the presentation, but along with Brooke, I'm going to be doing the best job I can here to keep an eye on the chat box and try to the best of my ability to answer any questions or concerns to the best of my ability in real time. as we're doing the presentation, unless they're incredibly complicated or very, very, very specific to your tribal needs and go beyond the scope of, what we can possibly do here in this more of a generic overview over the next four sessions altogether. Quite a bit of material to cover. Today is loaded with a lot of information, so I'm going to get right into it as you continue to put stuff up in the chat box on where you're from and your position and your tribal affiliation. Greatly appreciate that, and greatly already appreciate your participation in it. So I'm going to try to move along here. This is a little blurb about me. I was with the Native Learning Center for about 11 years as the director of compliance, and had a firsthand look and hands-on with the Indian Housing Block Grant for a number of years, because the Native Learning Center, Seminole Tribe of Florida, was a recipient of that federal funding. So I have kind of an intimate working relationship with NAHASDA and with EWONAP and with HUD and the IHBG and all the processes that go with it. And if you are new to this, you're in the right place, because we're going to be going over the fundamentals of a lot of different things. And let me just kind of get right into it here as we move along. So this is what we're going to do. This is what we got here that we're dealing with. The course description at the top there says this multi-session, 4 sessions altogether, provides the building blocks of understanding the responsibilities and obligations of grant management under the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996, aka NAHASDA. That's what we're going to be that's where we're going to start. And below that, you've got more of the agenda, not so much the objectives, but the agenda. Today, the top left there in the bold red print, excuse the barking of the dog behind me, my daughter's dog. You might hear that a little bit. I apologize for that. She's very, very active and loves me, whatever. All right, today we're doing part 1, understanding grants management. And the areas I'm going to be touching on are highlighted there. First, I'm going to get into some resources, some QR codes to help you with real-time links to what I consider to be some valuable resources, standard resources, and some new material there, some new reference material, followed by taking a quick look at award document terms and conditions. Then we're going to get into self-monitoring, which is very, very important. Self-monitoring, internal controls, very, very important. My focus as compliance director for all the time that I was involved in it, and even before coming to the Native Learning Center, is going to be on internal controls and compliance. It's going to come out in me. You have to bear with me as I go through it, because it's like in my DNA to go, to really drill down when it comes to processes, internal controls, policies, and procedure, because it all, in my opinion, it all really comes down to the fundamentals, the basics. And that's where internal controls and our policies and procedures come into play. So that's, you'll hear that come out of me, and I will do my best to try to break that down so that everyone can understand it. Please do ask questions or put up concerns where you can, and I will do, Brooke and I, mostly me, will do the best we can to try to answer the questions. Keep in mind that neither one of us, Brooke or myself, or actually anyone in the Native Learning Center staff, are attorneys or accountants, CPAs, auditors, those type of positions, highly professional positions. We are educators and trainers primarily, so that's the way we're going to be approaching this information, to provide you our best understanding of the fundamentals. Okay, back to the middle there in the red highlights, managing budget, records and reporting. A very important part of grants management is keeping, obviously this is a spinoff of compliance, documentation, proper reporting, and proper record keeping, which all plays a very, very critical part in the operation of what you're doing with your, with your federal funds. Extension, a little bit on extensions, adjustments, and closeouts to federal funding. And then lastly there, more information on regulatory and compliance. So basically what today is kind of prerequisite for the whole program. I'm going to be talking about kind of an overview of everything today. Then as you can see in the bottom left there, part 2, I'm going to take, and this would be next week, take a look at a more deep dive into the NAHASDA legislation. I'm going to break NAHASDA, or attempt to break that legislation, the act as we like to call it, down into more detail, the objectives, a little more explanation on the objectives and an overview, quite a bit of information on key points of NAHASDA, and then a little bit wrapping it up on negotiated rulemaking, which plays a part in that, the process that the federal government and tribal entities that participate go through on a kind of an irregular basis. I can't say it's done yearly, but it's done periodically, and it's called negotiated rulemaking. And that's how the legislation too is adopted, or not adopted, it's already adopted, how it is modified from time to time. It doesn't happen very often with legislation. Then the third section will be on the top right there. It says part 3, understanding the HUD Native American Housing Activities Program. So we're going to move from the NAHASDA legislation over to the regulations, and we're going to start with HUD's regulations, breaking those down, looking at specifically looking at 24 CFR Part 1000, subparts A, B, C, and then also D, E, H, and F, if I did the alphabet correctly there. And then lastly on Indian Housing Block Grant. All right, just taking a second to make sure I'm not missing anything in the chat box here. Okay. All right. And then lastly, bottom right there, last section, we'll get into the what's commonly referred to, kind of its street name, the super circular, which is specifically Office of Management and Budget's uniform guidance. It's 2 CFR Part 200, subparts A, B, and C on the first part of that, and then D, E, and F. A, B, and C primarily revert to federal regulations for the federal agencies to act upon, and then subparts D, E, and F are the parts, obviously that would be the bread and butter parts that apply to the funding recipients. That would be us. So subparts D, E, and F really contain, in my opinion, the most important areas of regulations that we need to be aware of, and when we're handling any kind of federal funding, let alone Indian Housing Block Grant, but any recipient of federal funding, whether you're a tribal entity, whether you're a TDHE, Tribally Determined Housing Authority, whether you are a nonprofit organizations like some TDHEs are, whether you're an institution of higher learning, or any other type of entity or organization that receives federal funding, that bottom right, that area, that uniform guidance is an area all those regulations apply to any organization that receives federal funding. And, the Native American Housing Activities Program that we're going to talk on day 3, that is specifically from HUD regarding those entities that are dealing with housing. So those are the 4 areas. So let's get started on part 1, the kind of the overview of understanding the basics. Overview, but nonetheless important, because there's going to be a lot of information. Let's start with resources. All right, let's get into that. There, you'll see a series of QR codes here If you've got your smartphone with you, you literally can bring it up to the screen and scan any one of these QR codes. And I see that Brooke is putting the link in there now, the web link as well. Let's start with the top left. That is the HUD ONAP. Hopefully I'm going to do it while I'm talking here just to make sure. I've got my phone. I'm going to put my camera on, going to scan that barcode and see where it takes me. It is taking me to ONAP. So in real time, you can go to the ONAP website using that QR code, which I think QR codes are the greatest thing right now. I've got a lot of them embedded in the presentation because I like for people to be able in real time to go look up information if they need to. So with that in mind, over to the top right, there should be a link for the NAHASDA legislation. Scan that QR code. It should take you directly to the act, to the NAHASDA Act, the original act. And you should, if you wish, you can, with any of these, I would strongly suggest that you not only use the QR code if you've never done this before to go to the site, find the site, download it, save it to your laptop, to your desktop, to your phone if you wish to. And, if you feel so inclined, print it out. So you have what I refer to as a desktop version of NAHASDA, desktop version and electronic version of the ONAP link with all of its resources as well and all of its explanation. Bottom left, just as I was saying before, 24 CFR Part 1000, that's HUD's Native American Housing Activities Regulations, 24 CFR Part 1000. What's unique, if you're not familiar with those regulations, they are written in a question and answer format. So scan the QR code, go look for yourself. You'll see there's a series of questions. First of all, it's broken out into 6 or 7 different subparts. But then as you look at it, you'll see that each of the subparts is written in a question and answer format. Some questions have a short answer, others have a lot more detail. Now, the heads up that I want to give you with that is timing. And I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The last one, bottom right, is the super circular, 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance. If you've never been there before, if you've never looked at it, there's the web link in the chat box. The very bottom one there that says at the very end, Part 200, that's the super circular. If you've never looked at this regulation before, it can be overwhelming. And those of you in the audience who have, I'm sure you agree with me, it can be a monster. And you've got to be able to understand how to navigate your way through it. First of all, and let me check, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to get up my smartphone and I'm going to go to the link. Yep, here we go. And just to make sure, well, you gave me NAHASDA. So that's the one above it. It wasn't real accurate with my aim. All right, let's go to there we go. All right, okay, very good. It took me to Part 200, Uniform Administrative Requirements. And what I want to point out is if you use this QR code and you scan down through it, what you're going to see is the regulations for 2 CFR Part 200 laid out in more of a narrative form, as opposed to the alternative for these regulations, 2 CFR Part 200, as you might recognize this phrase, the Federal Register. The Federal Register contains the same information here, but it's laid out in a way that's much harder to read. So if you want an easier to read format for 2 CFR Part 200, which is going to apply to you if you're receiving federal funds in any way, shape, or form, you've got to be able to understand what these regulations say. I suggest you use this particular format. What it's going to do is it's going to take you to what's referred to as eCFR, as in other words, electronic CFR, and in this case, Part 200, which has all of it. I like it because it's laid out in a narrative style instead of the Federal Register's 3 narrow columns. The Federal Register has been around forever. It's difficult to read at best. It's laid out like a newspaper where you've got 3 columns. You got to read from the top left to the top bottom of the first column, and then scroll back up to the top middle column and read down that, and then scroll back up to the third column and read from the top down. It's difficult to navigate. It's difficult to understand. It typically has very small print, where I like the electronic version where they just simply laid it out more in a paragraph, narrative, prose style, whatever you want to call it. It's much easier to read and a lot easier to navigate. So if you're looking, that's just a professional tip. If you're looking for any federal regulations, use the ecfr.gov. Brooke, if you don't mind putting that link into the chat box, small ecfr as Code of Federal Regulation.gov. From there, you can find all kinds of all the different regulations, not just these that you have in front of you. All right, let's go to the next one too, because these are the kind of the established sites for information. And thank you, Brooke, and the established QR codes. But I want to show you a couple new ones here. These are new resources that I strongly encourage each and every one of you to take a look at. Actually, let's start on the right side of the page there. It says updates to Davis-Bacon and related acts regulation. Now, if you're receiving federal funding, including the Indian Housing Block Grant, and you, as part of that, spend at or over $2,000 on construction, whether it be housing or any type of construction, you fall into the area, a whole new legislative area called Davis-Bacon and related acts regulation. Now, what's happened with Davis-Bacon regulations, prevailing wage, certified payroll records, all of that kind of stuff that comes with Davis-Bacon has changed. And just recently, like within the past month, new regulations have come out. What you have there in front of you is the QR code that takes you to the announcement of the new regulations. I strongly encourage you to take a look at it, get familiar with what Davis-Bacon legislation is and how it pertains to construction and how it pertains to recipients of federal funding, like all of us, right? No matter what kind of institution we are, if we're a hospital, if we're a college or university or an Indian tribe that receives federal funding and we're spending more than $2,000 on construction projects, this is going to apply to you. And they've changed the parameters on it. So you want to get up to speed. So that's the Davis-Bacon legislation and all the acts that come with it, related to it. And, prevailing wage, the certified payroll records, all of that kind of stuff is wrapped in. Prevailing wage is when you start using Davis-Bacon legislation as your guide, as the regulations. Davis-Bacon means that you're going to be using prevailing wage, which means wages are mandated by the Department of Labor. They are fixed at certain levels depending upon the construction trade, depending upon the state that you're doing construction in, and even the county, and sometimes even the city, depending upon where you're at. Most of the time, it's based on county within a state. But if you're doing construction in a larger city, it could get even broken down into municipalities. So you've got to become familiar with the Department of Labor, the legislation, the regulations, prevailing wage, and certified payroll records that all are part and parcel of that process. So do yourself a favor and scan it, download it to your laptop, make sure you understand what Davis-Bacon legislation is and how it works. All right, that's on the right. On the left, we've got something that's going to apply very directly to recipients of Indian Housing Block Grant. Some of you might be aware of this, some of you might not, that The Indian Housing Block Grant its reporting process is going through a metamorphosis right now. If you're receiving Indian Housing Block Grant in the past, you did your reports through what was called the EPIC system. EPIC is the acronym, the EPIC system. That is changing. It's going over now, transitioning within the next 2 or 3 weeks. I want to say September 14th of this year. So 2 weeks and a day, from now, literally, the EPIC system is going to be phased out. And the new system, the GEMS, GEMS system, the Grants Evaluation and Management System is going into effect. Now, if you're receiving Indian Housing Block Grant, this is going to be critical because your IHP, your Indian Housing Program, at the beginning of your fiscal year, and your APR, your annual performance report, at the end of your year is now going to flow through the GEMS program, not the EPIC program. So new system in place. There is the QR code in front of you, the website below it. Do yourself a favor, scan it, go to it, get familiar with it, because if you're not, you're going to be scrambling. This is going to be happening within the next 30 days. It's all going to be phasing out the old and bringing in the new, and you certainly don't want to be behind the curve here. So I wanted to point that out to you. Just let me refer to my notes. Okay. We are doing real good. Okay, let's keep going. Keeping an eye on the chat box. Thank you, everyone, for showing where you're from, your tribal appreciation. I appreciate that. Oh, look at that. Okay. My pyramid has a new look to it, which is wonderful. This is what I call the compliance pyramid, folks. And what we got, this is the hierarchy, basically, of compliance when it comes to grants management, in particular, federal grants management, dealing with federal funds. With those of us that are dealing with NAHASDA and the Indian Housing Block Grant and HUD, this is our hierarchy. At the top of the pyramid, we've got the NAHASDA legislation, as it shows in the very blueprint there towards the center. Statutes, NAHASDA, as I mentioned before. Then the next layer underneath that, the next most important, and really where all the action kind of comes from, are the regulations. Regulations 24 CFR Part 1000, that's the one from the ONAP office from HUD on Native American housing activities. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, the 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance. That's the bulk of our regulations that we're dealing with primarily for those of us that are receiving federal funding in the form of the Indian Housing Block Grant. Those are the legislation and then the federal regulations as well. Then underneath that, the lower, kind of the mid-level of the compliance pyramid, so to speak, are going to be the agency notifications and the program guidelines that come from the funding source, HUD, or most likely from ONAP, Office of Native American Programs, on a regular basis. And the agency directives and input from our contact people at those agencies. Then underneath that, what we have to deal with on a regular basis are, by and large, tribal regulations and rules and protocols. And for anything like the Seminole Tribe of Florida, there's a lot of regulations and guidelines and protocols and processes that you have to keep in mind, in everything that you do, let alone getting a resolution or ratification. There's a process for that. There's a process for getting anything approved, including budgets and whatnot. So there's going to be a lot of tribal processes that we have to be aware of. And then after that, it says internal controls, policies, and procedures. That's going to be our own internal processes that are mandated to have in place, but those are things that we have internally. I'm going to get a lot into internal controls, both financially, operationally, and compliance-wise, the three areas, okay, of internal controls. Then policies and procedures, policies and procedures are internal controls put into practice. That's what policies and procedures are. And then, of course, we've got best practices out there. And that's kind of that's the anecdotal stuff that I'll be bringing to the table here, so to speak. After traveling a lot of different tribes on behalf of the Native Learning Center over the past 11, 12 years, and still active in doing that, I've seen a lot of tribal entities, a lot of housing authorities over the time, and they shared a lot of information with me. And I want to make sure that I pass that on to you, so you have that information to you as well, to make up a solid base of information and knowledge for you related to grants management. Again, it's all kind of part of the fundamentals of what we're going to be talking about of grant management. So let's keep going. Let's got questions. We're going to get into what you've all probably seen. This is more grant writing, but nevertheless, let's talk a little bit about the announcement, the grant announcement. You've probably seen this before. I'm guessing most of you have seen it. If not, you're in the right place. This is a typical federal grant announcement, something you would see if you went to grants.gov to start searching for federal grants from the federal agencies, all of the federal. Grants.gov is the federal government's repository of all federal grants, all of them, from all the federal agencies. If you simply just went to grants.gov, you'd be overwhelmed with information. There's thousands and thousands of grants out there, and you've got to find a way to navigate your way through. If you haven't already, you can go to grants.gov. You can register and create a profile. I strongly recommend that if you're going to search for federal grants in any way, shape, or form, you do go to www.grants.gov, create a profile so that you can filter the information that's coming to you. You can do that. You can select the type of grants that you're looking for. And like I do, or I receive, every week, almost every day, I get a notice from grants.gov for grant opportunities, like you're seeing in front of you here, a notice of funding availability, sometimes referred to as a NOFA, notice of funding availability, or a NOFO, notice of funding opportunity. This is what it looks like if you go to grants.gov. This is the kind of the home page of what an opportunity looks like. Now, this one in particular, I want to just talk for a second. Here's the information. I'm going to put it to you a little easier to follow. Here's the information on that slide, that previous slide. Here's some of it in just a format that's easier to read. What I like about grants.gov, if you've never been on there before, and the information they provide you on grant opportunities, is they give you this information: funding opportunity numbers, tracking numbers that the feds use, the title of each grant opportunity. Now, this one happens to be the 2024 Social and Economic Development Strategies Grant, called the SEEDS Grant. And if we went back and look at it, and in fact, let me do that real quick, just going to jump back one slide. It's hard to read, but in the middle of the screenshot there, in red print, below the little eagle there, the logo, a couple lines down, you see red print. And what that says is, note, this is a forecast. It's also in the title, View Grant Opportunity Forecast. So in this case, the actual announcement hasn't rolled out yet. They haven't put it out yet, but they're kind of giving everyone a heads up. So moving forward, back to where we left off, it's the SEEDS grant. That information also talks about what type of grant it is. In this case, it is a grant as opposed to a cooperative agreement, for example. We'll get into that a little later. And it also gives you a lot of really good information. For example, expected number of awards. Whenever you see a low number like 25, you know that it's a federal award, and they're only given 25 awards. To me, that means it's pretty competitive, right? There's only a small amount. Then below that, there's the CFDA number, which is another tracking number, another identification number for federal funding. And then a little bit more on this next slide here. Information, it also contained on that screenshot information on cost sharing. Now, not all grants have a cost sharing requirement. This one does. I want to say it is 20%. Don't quote me on that. I'm just kind of doing that without getting into the NOFA. I'm making an educated guess that there obviously is cost sharing. It's stated on the synopsis page, but I'm thinking it's 20%. So cost sharing, which means that if you were going to apply for this grant, you would have to, you or the tribe or the TDHE or the nonprofit would have to put up 20% of the amount that you're going for, that you're requiring. It's got a match. Matches can be anywhere from 5% up to 50%. It just depends on the grant and it depends on the funder. So this one does have a match. It states right on the screenshot, match is required. I'm thinking it's 20%. What I like about this particular grant, other than what it's for, is look at the closing date. That's realistic. April 24th of 2024. That is, even though that was a forecast announcement, there's plenty of time. I think one of the worst things that we can do as grant writers, grant managers, is not give ourselves or our organizations enough time to get our act together to apply for funding. There's a lot of moving parts to put together a well-structured grant application, let alone managing it, just putting it together and making sure that the deadline is not hovering out there 2 weeks, 30 days, 90 days, which is a quick turnaround. This one, the end of April, that's a good, plenty of time, I would think, to get our ducks in a row and make sure that everything is ready. Program funding, $8,500. One thing you may or may not know, probably don't know, is last year and the year before that, this funding was at $9,500,000. So I think what we have here is a carryover from the Trump administration and what's referred to as sequestration, which is and sequestration goes before the Trump administration. He didn't do any favors here, but sequestration is the reduction of federal funding kind of across the board. And you can see it here, $1 million less this year, which makes, going back, remember there were only 25 recipients towards the bottom there, and the total amount is dropped $1 million, making this even more competitive. The award ceiling, in other words, the most we could get for this particular grant is $400,000, and the floor, or the least amount, the minimum amount, is $100,000. It also goes on to tell who is eligible for this, which is going to make it even more competitive. Eligible applicants, not just Native American tribal governments and their organizations, their TDHEs and their nonprofits, but also regular 501c3 charitable nonprofits. And it got cut off here, or it just didn't end up in the screenshot. Probably a lot of other organizations, such as institutions of higher education, also perhaps medical facilities, also perhaps churches or faith-based organizations. They're all eligible for federal funding. They all could be included in this particular grant, in any grant, and that makes the competition even more competitive. So just wanted to point that out. It's very, very important. I'm not sure everyone understands too the difference between a grant and a cooperative agreement. So let me take just a minute. For those of you that are new to this type of thing, let's talk about the difference between grants and cooperative agreements. A grant is probably what we are most familiar with, right? A minimal involvement from the funding agency, generally speaking, at the lowest level. of involvement with grants. The agency, I'm using the word partners because I couldn't come up with another word that represented its relationship. It's a strong relationship with the grant. Obviously, there's going to be interaction, there's going to be reports, there's going to be involvement, but it's more, or should be more, on a partnership level than anything else, with awardees in the to implement the the actual program, the specific pilot or program itself, in their award area. Okay, pretty straightforward. Where the cooperative agreement is kind of like what my kids would say, it would be like a grant on steroids. All right, it's the next step up, so to speak. Cooperative agreement means, as it says there on the top right, more involvement, substantial involvement from the funding agency in the recipient's operation. The agency selects grantee. The agency selects. That's the key word. Instead of partners, it selects grantees to conduct projects that grantees have developed. So much more. I know that the Native Learning Center went through a cooperative agreement a number of years ago when I was there, well, actually way back, 2014 and 15. Cooperative agreement doing the same thing that they do to this day, but there were funds segregated in addition to the normal funding, in addition to the normal IHBG, there were additional fundings under the auspices of a cooperative agreement. Normally, the relationship with the Native Learning Center and HUD, with ONAP, was pretty straightforward. It ran smoothly. They've been doing it for years. Little chain turnover in personnel. Everyone knew their roles on both ends, and it ran smoothly. When the cooperative agreement came in, the other ONAPs got involved with funding. So in addition to Eastern Woodlands ONAP being involved, we also had all the other ONAPs being involved, and information was flowing through those ONAPs to us, telling us how to implement our program and where to provide training. It was a much more complicated program and a slower process, if that makes sense. A slower process because we had more involvement with the authoritative bodies. So we moved. And it's slower process also because not all ONAPs are created the same. And I don't mean that facetiously. I mean, they're all different. I mean, they're the same. They come under the Office of Native American Programs under HUD. They still follow the same protocols, but everyone's different. They got different staff and they have different priorities, right? And they have different human resource capabilities. Some offices are bigger than others. So it slowed down the process. We didn't have the working relationship with those ONAPs in the same way that we had with Eastern Woodlands. So it added multiple levels of complexity to the program. Not that it was any less quality, but it was just a slower process trying to get things done. And at the bottom, you can see where it says, what is substantial involvement? Unfortunately, there is no definition in the regulations, in either the 2 CFR Part 200 ONAPS regulations. It's not in there. It's not in the HUD's 24 CFR Part 1000 Native American Housing Activities, or is it in NAHASDA, or is it anywhere in IHBG? It's not defined anywhere. It's unique, it's undefinable, it's nebulous, and every cooperative agreement is going to be a little bit different depending upon the agency and depending upon the resources that they have and they're willing to share, and your own capacity to be able to deal with it. So just, nothing, I'm not trying to say don't stay away from cooperative agreements. What I'm saying is cooperative agreements come with usually more involvement at the authoritative level than compared to a grant. You really can't compare them. They're apples and oranges. So enough there. All right, very good. I just wanted to bring that to your attention on the difference between the two, cooperative agreement So the award document, now we're getting more into grants management. Just recommend, if you're new to grant management, not only do you need to understand the grant writing aspects that we just touched on a little bit with, reaching out, understanding the difference in grants, but now in the true grant management, the award document, let's start there. The terms and condition. This is where the devil's in the details, so to speak. You want to make sure every grant is different. Every grant has different protocols. It has different matching requirements. You've got to understand as grant management, as compliance people, supervisors, managers, program operators, office managers, you got to understand these terms and conditions. You should, just in the way you went to the trouble of reading the notice of funding availability to NOFA, take the same amount of care to understand the terms and conditions, both operational, not both, but three aspects: operational, financial, and compliance. Understand the terms and conditions that are mandated and or suggested in the terms and conditions. You should carefully read, reread that terms and condition to understand the award document, to make sure you understand all the moving parts of it. It's a legally binding contract. So, you've got that to deal with. Make sure you understand your rights and obligations as a grantee, because your fiduciary responsibility, which means you are the shepherd, you and your team and your organization are the shepherd of federal funds. And with that comes a lot of scrutiny from the agency, especially if it's a cooperative agreement, right? Even more stipulations and even more microscopic review and micromanagement, not to be facetious, but micromanagement. And we haven't even talked about the audit requirements that come with these. We'll get to that. Okay. Only authorized representative may sign the award document. Yes, that's right. Only certain people. Usually it's the authorized organization representative, known as the AOR, or some other chief executive, maybe tribal council chair or whatever, but usually it narrows down. Someone is going to be authorized to sign off and be the point person for the award. Let's try to move forward here. Bear with me. There we go. This is a screenshot of the award, of a typical award document, terms and conditions. Now, the very top, above the little red arrow, above the top, the center section, the top, that's all identification information. Who's the recipient of this award, what agency it's coming from, who are the contacts, what's the dollar amount. But what I want to point out to you is the lower half. And in this case, this is just a screenshot of page 1. There was a page 2 and a page 3, all containing provisions. And this is the area, if anything, where we need to pay the most attention to: the provisions, or the terms and conditions. They call it provisions here, but it's basically the terms and conditions of the federal award. It behooves you to know what those conditions are. They're going to fall into 3 main areas: operational, financial, and compliance. And folks, those 3 areas of terms and conditions on the federal award match up very nicely with all of the verbiage that's contained in the federal regulations. We'll get into that and we'll drill down into that a little later, but you'll see the parallels between the terms and conditions on the award documents and what the federal government is saying you've got to have in place as far as federal internal controls. Now, some of you might be saying at this point, this is all well and fine, but Vince, I don't get into any of this stuff. I'm the financial person, or I am the bookkeeper, or I am the office manager, or I am, play another role within the organization, within the TDHE, within the nonprofit. regardless of that, we all need to understand how, a couple things here from my perspective. We need to understand what grant writing is all about and how that comes about, and what I just kind of touched on very, very briefly. We could spend days on grant writing. I just touched on it with a little bit. And so that's one. And on the other side of the coin, we really need to understand the big picture, as it says there in the title, Understanding Grants Management as a Whole. So we understand, even if we're not responsible for the financial part of it or for the development of policies and procedures, I think as an organization, we are obligated, when you work there, you're obligated to do a couple things. First of all, you're obligated to meet the code of conduct and the protocols and the policies of your employer, right? Whether it be a tribe, a housing authority, a nonprofit, a hospital, a church, whatever, we are obligated to meet those operational responsibilities. Same thing applies here. As employees, when we start receiving funds from outside organizations, right? Whether it be federal agencies or whether it be on the private side from corporations, community organizations, or foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates, that's not our money. That is an investment given to our organization, and the donor, whether it's a federal funding agency or a corporate entity like Walmart or a Native-centric community organization like the Shakopee Foundation, we are responsible for those funds. They are investments that have been put in our trust. And not only do we have a fiduciary responsibility that I alluded to, a trust responsibility, those same investors or donors, whatever you call them, are looking for a return on investment one way or another, even if they're a federal agency, in the form of accurate reports and accurate financial statements coming from you. They are looking for return on investment. Why? Because they have higher authorities to report to, right? All of those entities. The Shakopee Native-centric Community Foundation has its tribal council to report to. The Walmart has the Walmart family to report to and all the higher ups. Same thing with any corporate structure, whether it's UPS or Barnes and Noble. They all have philanthropic divisions within their structure. They all give to nonprofit organizations like tribes and other 501c3 organizations. So they're looking for a return on investment to their stockholders and whatnot. And federal agencies have the same thing too. They're reporting their findings and their status with their recipients, which are us, to higher authorities, all the way up to the president of the United States and his or her council or cabinet. And, sometimes that works on our behalf with program increases, funding increases. Sometimes it doesn't, sequestration, but never lose track of the fact that these grants are actually, consider them to be financial investments in what we do. And with any type of, we would expect the same thing from our bank, from our lending institution, from our stockbrokers that we employ, right, as individuals. We would expect the same duty of care, that we need to do the same thing. So everyone plays a part. It's a village. It takes a village to write a grant. It takes a village to manage a grant. And here we talking about these provisions, these terms and conditions are the very important part. So understanding these terms and conditions to the extent, the most extent that you can, is going to be critical. All right. Time to pause for a second, catch my breath, let you guys, readjust for a little bit. I'm looking at the chat box. I'm looking at the time. We're approaching the top of the hour here. We've already put in nearly 60 minutes of presentation, and I got a lot more information to go. So I'm going to move through, now that we've laid some of that out, I'm going to move through not very quickly, but I want to continue on and get into some very, very important areas, critically important. Now, this is coming from me as a retired, experienced, seasoned compliance director, working with federal funding for a considerable amount of years, right? And prior to that, also working with federal funding, working with nonprofits. I can tell you firsthand that strong operational structure with internal controls and a good monitoring process is worth its weight in gold. Now, generally speaking, when it comes to monitoring, if you're the recipient of the Indian Housing Block Grant, which I'm an educated guess that most of you are, right? NAHASDA, IHBG funding recipients, you're obligated to, or mandated to have an internal control system in place and to have a monitoring system in place. They refer to it as self-monitoring. You know, I like to call it internal. It's just that. It's an internal audit. Self-monitoring is a process of reviewing your processes, all of your processes, operational, financial, and compliance, to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to do. And when they are not, that you take action. These are things that are mandated to us through our internal controls. If you don't believe me, I'll show you where you can look and actually read the verbiage in the federal regulations that tells us we've got to have self-monitoring, we've got to have internal controls, we've got to have financial controls, etc. I'll guide you to that. But let's keep going here. Let's start here. This is where you can go to if you want more information on how to establish internal controls. Not so much how to establish, but the process of mandating that we have internal controls. You can go to the federal regs. There's the website. Brooke posted it in the chat box. You're going specifically to 2 CFR Part 200.303, which is the section in the federal regulations on internal controls. It doesn't tell you how to do it. In fact, there's not a lot there. If you look at it, if you literally go to it right now, you can in real time with the QR code, you can go to it. I know it by heart. I've been there 1,000 times. I've looked at it. I've looked at .303 and 302, its twin sister, on financial controls. You can go to them. 303 gets into 5 different areas of internal controls that you are mandated to have if you receive any kind of federal funds, not just IHBG, but any kind of federal funds. 1, you've got to have what's referred to, write this phrase down if you haven't already or never heard of it before, reasonable assurance, 2 words. Brooke, if you wouldn't mind putting that phrase in the chat box, 2 words, reasonable assurance with an A, not insurance, but assurance, reasonable assurance. All right. Thank you. That is how the feds lead off with internal controls, that we must have internal controls that provide reasonable assurance that they're doing everything they're supposed to do. This section on internal controls doesn't tell you how to do it, doesn't tell you how to write your policies and procedures. All it says is that you've got to have reasonable assurance. So my tip when we get to, it's not really heavy in this session, any sessions we're doing, but when we get to the dedicated training sessions on internal controls and how to write policies and procedures, I tell everyone, keep this phrase in mind because these are that phrase is used by the federal government. It's not an absolute, which I like about it. It's actually a default. And what I recommend to organizations that are putting together their internal controls, their policies and procedures, is to use the verbiage that the feds use. And in this case, the phrase reasonable assurance. So in other words, you start every internal control, because you got to have them in writing, right? Your policies and procedures. You start every single one of them with the same verbiage, something to the effect of in accordance with federal regulations, 2 CFR Part 200 Uniform Guidance, aka Super Circular, with reasonable assurance, we, and you state your name, have put together this policy pertaining to a variety of different things: code of conduct, confidentiality, operational hours, everything you can think of from an operational standpoint. On a program standpoint, if you're housing, you still, or anything, EPA, whatever, you still start your policies and procedures, your internal controls, using that same verbiage. If you have any questions on that, I'm knowing I'm getting into the weeds there a little bit. Send me an email, send Brooke an email, send the Native Learning Center an email. They'll get it to me. I'll try to help you. If you're looking for verbiage on internal controls, I can help you out. So that's number one. When you go to 2 CFR Part 200-303, there's only 5 things there. One is we should be using the phrase reasonable assurance of compliance. I like that phrase because it gives us flexibility, right? When you say your policy is with reasonable assurance of compliance that we're going to do this, it means that it gives you a little bit of flexibility to work with what's really happening. So I like that phrase. Okay. The second one, the second rule, so to speak, under 2 CFR Part 200-303 internal controls, number 2 is that you comply with all of the laws and regulations that pertain to the funding. That you comply with all those laws. That's all it really says. Pretty straightforward. Okay. The third thing, now we're starting to get into the nitty-gritty. The third thing is that, and these are the exact words, you evaluate and monitor compliance. Folks, it's in the regulations. You have to evaluate and monitor your compliance with a capital C. Compliance means, everything that you're doing, all the protocols you have in place, including your policies and procedures. You've got to evaluate and monitor. There's your requirement for self-monitoring and for an evaluation, which is self-monitoring. Then it takes it to the next logical step. Number 4, take action on non-compliance. So if you only go through the first 3 steps and you put together an evaluation process and you monitor, but then you don't take action to correct something that's not working properly or to correct a non-compliant situation, you're breaking 2 rules, right? You're breaking the mandatory rules set up in the regulations pertaining to federal funding, right? As stated in 2 CFR Part 303, Subpart 3. And you're probably going to run into issues with your audit when it comes, or both of them, your program review, if you have one. Those auditors, those program reviewers are going to be looking for your internal controls, your policies and procedures. They're going to ask you to show them to you in writing, and they're going to want to make sure that you followed up on each and every one of them, right? They're going to want to see your self-monitoring internal controls, self-monitoring report. They're going to want to see if you found any discrepancies, and they want to see what happened, right? So take evaluate and monitor, number 3, and the number 4 under that regulation, take action. The 5th one is relatively new, came out in the past, I want to say past year and a half, okay? And that is what's referred to as PII, which is an acronym for personally, Brooke, if you don't mind, personally identifiable information, PII, personally identifiable information, the safeguarding of PII. All right. This is the reason this has come about is over the past several years, not just recently. The regulation is new, but the cause behind it is old. It goes back several years. It goes back to the year 2000, when those of us of a certain age remember a certain organization called Enron. Maybe this is familiar to some of you. Yes, I can see you shaking your proverbial heads out there. Some of you that are seasoned, older people like me. You were around in 2000 when Enron collapsed They were doing a huge Ponzi scheme to the tune of billions of dollars, and they were destroying financial records. It was fraud, plain and simple. And what happened, long story short there, legislation went into effect called Sarbanes-Oxley in the year 2000, which put a lot of stipulations on avoidance of destroying of financial records and private information, because that's what Enron was doing, destroying records before they were discovered, and many people went to jail over that. Yeah, PII, thank you. Personally identifiable information, that's it. So the protection of PII, it is stated in the regulations that you've got to have a mechanism in place to safeguard PII. Well, to do that, first of all, you have to be able to identify what PII is within your operation. Who do you cater to? What kind of information could be considered private in the clientele that you deal with? So in housing, for example, perhaps it's information that a current or new or past homeowner or renter provided to you or to your organization in the way of income to qualify, or social security number to identify themselves, or driver's license, any other identifiable information, their marital status, criminal background record, passport number, all kinds of different things. You need to identify what that information is and then put in place mechanisms in your internal controls that spell out how you're going to limit access to that information, whether it's hard copy or electronic or a combination of both. You've got to have mechanisms in place so that not everyone on the planet has access to that, what's considered private information. Okay. So you probably, if it's electronic, you probably need to have conversations with your IT people to make sure you have electronic mechanisms in place that stop certain individuals from having access to those files. Same thing on the hard copy side, limited access, safeguarding that information. And then not only that, being able to have the policies and procedures that spell that out. It has to be done. And nowadays it's becoming more and more sophisticated, right? We've got biometrics to deal with. I got two examples of that. Native Learning Center had, the whole Seminole Tribe had what's called the Chronos system, which is a biometric scanning device. In this case, it was fingerprint and a 4-digit code, so that's at the low end of biometrics, right? But all of HR, all of our personnel records, all of our vacation time and work time flowed through that system. So safeguarding that information was critical, right? Now, today, I'm in Atlanta. I went through Delta. I went through West Palm Beach to Atlanta. I went through what's called the Clear system. If you're familiar with that, it used to be just Delta, but I think other carriers are doing it now. It's a biometric scan of your retinas, your eyes, right, in your face. So they do that, and they do a background check. And now every time I go into an airport that has the Clear system, I walk up to the kiosk, they scan my eyes, and boom, I go straight through, fast track through TSA security. It's great. It's great, but it's a biometric system, and it's PII at its best, right? The biometric, they've got more information than I probably want them to have, but they do. And so that's another example of it. And it's growing by leaps and bounds. Every day, technology is making biometrics and that stuff more prevalent. So it's becoming more and more of an issue, and we need to find mechanisms to protect it, right? Okay. So enough said on that. Internal controls, policies and procedures, PII. You can go to 200-303. You can go to 200-302, which is the financial. Now, there's more information on 302 financial because it deals with a lot of generally accepted accounting practices, GAAP standards. And if you know anything about that, there's a lot of protocols, a lot of separation of duties under GAAP standards. So there's going to be a lot more financial controls, but there's nothing surprising. It doesn't pack the punch that the internal controls, the 200-303 does. 303 is much broader, and the federal government is much closed chest, closed car. They don't give you a lot of information. It's nebulous. You're forced with these internal controls, the 200-303, unlike its sister 302 financial that gives a lot of detail of what to do. This doesn't. It only has the 5 areas that I mentioned, which puts us in a position where we have to understand the regulations, the legislation, and the protocols to be able to put in place internal controls that meet the federal standards, because they're not defined, if that makes sense. They're not defined. This is a nebulous gray area in the federal regulations. You've got to have internal controls. They might as well just said that. You got to have internal controls. They don't tell you how to do it, what specific policies to have. So you have to protect your program by making sure that you understand the regulations and the operations and the compliance to the best of your ability. That's why I'm saying it takes a village to understand that. This is something that probably needs to be discussed at every meeting, at every level, whether it's a committee meeting or whether it's a board of directors. Your internal controls, your processes, making sure that everything is operating smoothly, because at some point, if you were to hire me to come in and do a self-monitoring, and I've done that before, I've gone into organizations, done their self-monitoring, you would treat me like, you should treat me like I were an auditor or a program reviewer, because that's basically what I would be doing. And the first thing I'm going to ask out of you is, what are your internal controls? Where can I see them? They should be in writing. I want to see your internal controls. I want to see every policy and procedure. And what I'm going to be looking for are up-to-date internal controls that reflect every part of operation, every part of financial activity, every part of compliance. So you can't tell me or any auditor that you haven't updated your policies in 10 years. That's like the kiss of death. You don't want that. You want to say these are reviewed on a regular basis. Some are a little bit older than others. We can give you that, but because nothing much has changed in that particular process. I get that. But when we say that, or we identify, or we don't have policies, or they're 12, 15 years old, that is a finding. That is a problem. Everything has changed. Regulation, this 2 CFR Part 200-303 has gone through 7 different generations since when it first came out in 2014. So that's basically one a year, right? Almost one a year, a revision, a change. Sometimes the feds tighten up the rules. Sometimes they loosen them. Like this one here, you see on your screen, it's very loose. It's very wide open for interpretation. So I'd be looking for your internal controls. I'd be looking for your policies and procedures. I'd be looking for the way that you structure them. I'd be looking for uniformity. I would be making sure that each policy sounds like it came from the same person, written in the same way, not like it was written by 17 different people, right? Or it was written after a catastrophic accident happened, or because that's a lot of times when policies are written, when something terrible happens or when something's discovered, right? Instead of proactive looking in advance. So, okay, enough on that. Let's keep going, unless you have questions. All right, monitoring. We talked a lot about monitoring. At the bottom bullets there, 3 important areas of internal controls. Thusly, 3 important areas of your monitoring process: your operation, your financial activities, and your compliance protocols, actions. In the compliance, I would include your literal document of internal controls and all of your policies, making sure that you've got everything. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. I'm looking at my notes too, and the chat box and the presentation. Okay, very good. All right, let's see if we can move on to the next one. Managing budgets. Managing budgets, very, very important. Let's just touch on that. Touch on that real quick. Trying to move the slide. Bear with me. There we go. Not going to dwell a whole lot on it because this is not a financial course. Make sure you're working with the most current approved budget as captured in the award document. And sometimes, most of the time, it's laid out differently in the award document than probably what you have in your chart of accounts or in your budget. And is it okay to manipulate it so that it fits your budget? Yes. As long as you're not radically changing the dollar amounts significantly, and of course the bottom line, then yeah, you can take the award and you can adjust it to fit the format of your grant, as long as you're not changing anything. So you've got that going for you. Talked about budgets. This is just an example of, this is more grant writing, but of the example we gave of the notice a couple slides back, managing budgets, this is just a breakout of the two areas that particular SEEDS grant provides for: self-sufficiency in social services and economic self-sufficiency. The SEEDS grant would provide 80% of the funding and gives you the dollar amount. The maximum is $400,000, and there would be the matching. The tribe or the TDHE or whatever would have to put up 20%. In this case, $80,000 if they wanted to get the full 400. So, all right, another area of important. I think we're getting very close to the end here. Reports and reporting. Regulations, you can look this up yourself. I don't have a QR code, but you can use the one from a couple slides back, or you can go to 2 CFR Part 200.334 and you can look it up yourself. Retention of records. What it says here is what the feds say is right in the middle of the paragraph. It says 3 years, 3 years from the end of your program year. So if you're October 1 through September 30th, we're coming up into September starting tomorrow. The end of your fiscal year would be the end of September. 3 years from that point. Now, that's the regulation. Is it practical? Probably not. Probably not. Should you keep records longer than 3 years? I highly recommend it. The feds say 3, even the IRS for our personal and for business standards. Let me rephrase that. Even the IRS for business operations requires 7 years. So I would suggest something more. If you're destroying records after 3 years, I would rethink that. Archive, yes. Should we, and as we move along, transitioning from hard copy to electronic records is the way to go. It's the trend. It's where we see a lot of emphasis as well from the federal governments wanting us to move to electronic record keeping, right? So that's a trend, electronic record keeping. And so is the fact that we need to keep these records longer than 3 years, more like almost indefinitely. Even 7 might not even be around. And I've gone through personal experience with this, where we were asked, when I was at the Native Learning Center, we were asked to go back and look at records from several years ago. It was more than 7, as I recall, going back and looking at, in our case, it was attendance records, going back to conferences held back in the day, to look for a certain tribe, a certain person that attended, and that went several years back. So you never know when this is going to happen. And some of the federal agencies, I've experienced this too, are not up to speed, just like the IRS, real up to speed on closeouts either. So, programs that we've had that we've closed out on our end aren't necessarily always closed out on the federal funder side. And you run into a situation where you had a cooperative agreement that closed out in 2015 on your end, the recipient's end, but the funding agency has not sent final paperwork or done any type of review to close it out. And here we are pushing 8 years after the fact that it's been not operated, reported in our quarterly SF 425, which is the standard form 425, the quarterly fiscal report, closing out that fund, but yet it hasn't technically been closed out. So I think I answered my own question. Do we keep our records electronic and hard copy more than 3? Certainly. It meets the letter of the law, but it's not a practical regulation. So keeping the records longer would be highly suggested. I think I skipped one. I'm going to go back. Oh, that was retention of records. And then here's the one on monitoring. Not only is it listed in CFR 200-303 that I went over a moment ago, but it's also specifically mentioned in 2 CFR Part 200-329, monitoring and reporting program performance. Monitoring by the non-federal entity, that's us. The federal funding recipients are referred to as NFEs, non-federal entities, by the federal government. So don't be confused by that. Another way to say this is monitoring by the federal funding recipient, us. The entity is responsible for the oversight of the operations of the federal award support activities. And the support activities would be financial, compliance, everything else. The non-federal entity, NFE, must monitor its activities under the federal awards to assure compliance with applicable regulations and performance expectations are being achieved, right? That's what our APR is, right? That is one of the reports we submit to show that if we're receiving Indian Housing Block Grant, that we did what we said we were going to do in our IHP. With that APR comes a self-monitoring report is supposed to be included with that. So all of that is ingrained into this regulation here. We've got to do it. It's mentioned in 2 separate places that we got to do it. And the bottom one says reporting program performance. The Fed's awarding agency must use OMB approved common information collections, like we've been talking about, as applicable when providing financial and performance reporting information. In other words, they're not supposed to pull punches and provide, make you do reports that aren't standardized. Okay. So by and large, I think they do that. But there are obligations, as it says here, for monitoring and so forth. We talked about record reporting. The middle section there with the octagons around it, data-driven management. Everything is going more and more towards data-driven everything. Look at the Indian Housing Block Grant and the reports that I just mentioned, the IHP and the APR. Once upon a time, back when I first started, they were Word documents that were sent in at the beginning and the end of our program year. Then they went to an Excel sheet format. Then they went to a fillable PDF. Then they went to the Epic system, migrated to the Epic system, and now they're migrating into this new GEMS system. Because everything is becoming more and more data-driven. If you go to the regulations that I was talking about, and you look at the beginning part of it, it talks about all of the data-driven forces that are being put on the federal agencies at an agency level from higher authorities, Office of Management and Budget, which basically oversees all the regulations for all the federal agencies, right? OMB. They are putting pressure on the respective agencies to cut back on funding. That's one. That's sequestration that I talked about before. And to force this that you see in front of you, more data-driven operations of the recipients. That's why our reports, our financial reports, and of course our reports, our IHP and our APR are moving more towards data-driven requirements more and more and more in that area. And the federal agencies, HUD included, are adopting their reciprocal end, to be able to adapt to that. That's where GEMS is coming from. The problem that they have, and it trickles down to us, is sometimes they can't keep up. The respective agencies like HUD, Department of Energy, Department of Labor, can't keep up with some of the regulations that OMB are putting in place. That's also something we need to be aware of as grant managers. Some of the information trickling down from the feds is happening so abruptly, like this GEMS thing for reporting, that a lot of the agencies literally can't keep up with the changes. They just don't have the manpower. They don't have the resources. So it's something we need to be aware of. Perfect example of that when ONAP implemented the EPIC system. Oh, no, I take that back. It was during the EPIC era. So over the past 4 years. What changed was, maybe you know this, maybe you don't, the DUNS number, which was a tracking number that we were all assigned if we were receiving federal fund, went away, and it was replaced with the unique entity identifier, UEI, a unique entity identifier number, which was different than the DUNS number. Okay, we had to go through a process through SAMS.gov to get that new number. If you don't know much about it, send me an email. I'll bring you up to speed. That's a separate conversation. But those of you out there with 5 or 6, 7 years experience, remember that morphus that we went through. And we actually wasn't even that old, 3 or 4 years ago. Went through that change. Okay. What happened there is that the APR, the IHP and the APR that ONAP was providing was not compatible with the UEI, the new UEI number. It was a fillable PDF. So it still had the place where the DUNS number was to be entered. And it just stopped everything because the funding recipients like us, we knew we had a new number, but it wasn't compatible with the system. So we had this conversation with the ONAP office that they're going to have to change their form and to make it adaptable and, so that we could put in the number. They did that, but it delayed things. They did get it resolved, but it bogged down the process. It was a trickle-down effect, and that's something we need to be aware of as funders. We talked about, one more. 329, record monitoring and record keeping. We talked about that. Talked about that. Format depends upon the agency, depends upon the funding. IHP, Indian Housing Block Grant has the IHP and the APR format. On this screen, what you're seeing is what we've already talked about it. The QR code there is for the new GEMS. Had that earlier. That's the QR code to take you to the GEMS site if you're at all interested in reading more about that. If you know everything about it, that's wonderful. But if you have, thank you. Just put the web link to it. If this is new to you, I strongly suggest that you get familiar with the GEM system because it's the EPIC system, the current system for reports, especially for the Indian Housing Block Grant recipients, is phasing out. I want to say September 14th. EPIC goes away, GEM starts. So you might even have to submit a new IHP under the new GEM system so that it's not just a year-end report they receive in the next 30 days. You also have an IHP in there too. So you want to look deeper into that. Okay. Just going to go over, we talked about extensions. A lot of times if you're dealing with adjustments and extensions, if it's significant, in this case, I think we have it spelled out. Do I have it spelled out here? Well, that second bullet there says 10%, but I think it's a little bit more than that. It's a little more gracious, up to more like 25% change in a budget line item, up to can be moved around. But you've got to be careful when you start moving funds around or decreasing budget amounts or changing programs. You might have to have what's referred to as a prior approval from your funding agency. I know you have to do that with HUD. If with the ONAP, if you're going to change the dollar amount, that type of thing, you're going to have, and there's a lot of, I don't think I have it here, all the different areas, but especially when you're changing or reducing your budget amount or making significant changes to your program, or another third one that I discovered the hard way, not with our organization, but with another one in your self-monitoring. If you have a large turnover of key staff, that could be a red flag as well. and show up on your self-monitoring report. We hope not, but it could lead to a need for prior approval and more involvement, more cooperative agreement type involvement from the funding agency. Let's see. Okay, we talked about closeout. Come on. There we go. There we go. And the last one here to finish up, because we're at the bottom of the hour. Thanks for hanging with me. We talked about regulatory. We talked about all these things. This is basically the bread and butter of what we talked about today. NAHASDA legislation, then the two middle ones are our regulations that we dealt with, both on the HUD side for IHBG housing and then for all recipients of federal funding with the uniform guidance, right? And then we wrapped it up with discussions on internal controls, internal stuff, the internal controls, the policies and procedures, the best practices, and anecdotal information that I brought to trying to bring to the table on my insights on it. So that's what we talked about during this session. And I've been watching the chat box, hoping, trying to see if you had any questions or concerns. So just keep moving on. Here we are. We're closing out and I'm about ready to kick it back over to Brooke, but I just want to take 1 minute. We're at the bottom of the hour here. I realize that top left, this is what we went over today. Resources and the grant announcement at the very beginning, followed by award document review of terms and conditions, provisions, that's another word, another term, self-monitoring, internal controls, managing budget, record and reporting, executions, adjustments. Whoop, back up. I'm sorry, I touched. There we go. Extensions, and then finished up with a little regulatory compliance. So one quick question here. Can awarded federal fund budget be formatted to a funding recipient's accounting system? A, no. Just like cutting off the tag to a new bed mattress, you will certainly go to prison for this violation. That's answer A. Okay. B, no. The federal award budget cannot be manipulated to fit the funding recipient's budget format. Or C, yes, among other reasons, the federal award budget can be manipulated to fit a funder's recipient's specific accounting format, as long as we don't make radical changes to it. Or D, none of the above. And of course, the answer is the most reasonable one. Although I do like answer A. You certainly go to prison if you cut it off, just like those bed mattress tags. Yes, among other reasons, the federal award budget can be manipulated. It can be manipulated, strong word. It can be adjusted to fit your chart accounts. It could, you can manipulate it a little bit. As long as you're not radically changing the bottom line, you're good. So that's it. That's all I have. I am going to, at this point, thank everyone for participating. I'm going to turn it back over to Brooke to close out. I hope I see you all next week for part 2. So thank you for your time, everybody.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much, Vince, for your time and effort with this presentation. I know we all certainly learned a lot. As I close out the webinar, guys, feel free to submit any other questions or comments that you have for Vince into the chat box. Right now, I am launching the survey for everybody who's in here. So please take a moment to complete this about today's webinar. It only takes a minute or so, and your feedback really helps us to do more of what's working well and improve upon what maybe needs it. We invite you to really be as candid as you'd like because the survey is anonymous. There's the link up on the screen, and again, I have launched it for you. We hope you can join us for our next webinar. That's going to be next week on September 7th, and it is the second in the series that Vince has started today. So that's Tribal Grants Management Part 2. Registration is free, and you can see all the different times that it's occurring in for your various time zones. I saw we had people from all over today. That's awesome. And you can feel free to access this and any other recorded webinars online on our website, www.nativelearningcenter.com. We have a Catheta Webinars tab featuring a recorded webinars section. You can click on any one of the webinars that we've done for the past 2 years and feel free to view them and share them with your friends and colleagues. And please also check out our upcoming events posted to our various social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we even have a podcast titled Hopathanga Native American Podcast, where we discuss focus topics within tribal housing and self-determination. You could listen on Simplecast, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, as well as view the video recordings with our guests on YouTube. All right, guys, once again, I want to thank you, all of our participants, for joining us today. We hope that you have a wonderful day, and we hope to connect with all of you again really soon. I'm going to go ahead and end the recording.